And that jarring cacophony tells you that you're listening to the Power of Three podcast, the Doctor Who podcast that goes here, there and everywhere, up the stairs, down the stairs, into the bathroom, probably into the loft and has a nosy there too, just in case there's any sign of Doctor Who content. I'm Kenny Smith, and here we are. It's time for another of our book club episodes. And today we're venturing into a particular territory that some listeners have asked, why have we not done so many of these before? We're talking about The New Adventures. That's the Doctor Who original novels published by Virgin between 1991 and May 1997. We have big plans for The New Adventures, but we don't want to spoil them just yet. But we thought it'd be appropriate to bring you one today. And joining us will be a good pal of the podcast, the wonderful Christopher Bulis. And this was, of course, his first Doctor Who novel. And he'd go on to write a significant number of adventures afterwards. He'd do Missing Adventures for State of Change, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, The Eye of the Giant, Twilight of the Gods, and A Device of Death, all of which we featured on The Power of Three. He also wrote the 8th Doctor adventure, Vanderdecken's Children, which you can hear over on Pieces of Eighth. And he also wrote 4 past Doctor adventures. The Ultimate Treasure for the 5th Doctor, City at World's End for the 1st Doctor, Imperial Moon again for the 5th Doctor, and Palace of the Red Sun for the 6th Doctor. But we're going back to the very beginning with Chris today, as we're going to be talking about Shadowmind. Shadowmind was the 16th novel in the New Adventures range, which came out just after White Darkness by David A. McEntee. And this was released on the 15th of July 1993, way back in the 30th anniversary year. And it features the 7th Doctor, Ace, and Bernice. So if we take a look at the cover, which was painted by Chris, we've got Benny there with a soldier holding a gun, which looks quite similar to the ones that the Cybermen would later use on the TV series. And in the background you can see there's some domes with lights projecting from the top of them. They look like the top of an egg which has been buried, but we'll find out more about that. And we can see there's other soldiers in the distance too. So if we turn the book over, we can see that it tells us Arden, a planet of hills and streams and forests. Peaceful, friendly. There is no indigenous intelligent life there. What is there then? The Doctor said. It's a new colony world, Doctor. We started developing it 3 years ago. But there is something on Arden. Something that steals minds and memories. Something that is growing stronger. Something that can reach out to the regional stellar capital, Tairngare, where the newest exhibit in the sculpture park is a blue box, surmounted by a flashing light. There we go. That's our tease. Thank you very much for that, Chris. Now, normally we'd bring you a reading from the book at this point, but we're not going to do that today. Instead, we're going to bring you the Doctor Who magazine Prelude that featured in issue 202. And the Preludes were a range of short previews that pretty much were a prequel to each of the New Adventures. And we've got this one for you today, and this is read by James Hadwin Bennett.
Garrel Manton gathered up his kit bag and took one last look around the small service apartment, checking that he had packed everything. Satisfied that it was all as it should be, he touched a control on the monitor terminal and said, "Activate vacant maintenance mode, computer. Record or redirect all communications as per the usual list. See you in 20 days. "Goodbye, Mr. Manton," replied the androgynous voice of the computer, with programmed friendliness. "Have a nice trip." The door automatically closed and locked behind him as he stepped out onto the 3rd floor landing of the apartment block. The lift tube beckoned, but he took the stairs by habit, lights coming on automatically as he started down them, washing out the view of the night-lit city from the landing window. Over the skyline, the brighter stars twinkled invitingly in the clear air. It was nearly midnight, but he did not mind the lateness of the hour. Night seemed an appropriate time to set out, considering his destination. Besides, the travel tubes would be less busy. As he stepped off the 2nd floor landing, all the stairwell lights blinked out at once, plunging him into semi-darkness. He teetered at the top of the flight, snatching at the handrail, fighting for balance, and an immaterial force seemed to press at his back, thrusting him out into the gloomy void over the stairs, which rushed up to meet him with unreasonable speed. Recovering in hospital the next day, the doctor responded to Garrel's protests with professional intransigence. He was sorry that he would miss the ship's proving flight, but did he not realise what a serious fall he had taken? True, the broken bones were easily repaired, but there was some spinal damage that would need regeneration. With luck, Garrel might be up in time to welcome his ship back. He was restless that night, knowing the broadsword would depart without him. He cursed the faulty lighting circuit that had failed him and the service engineers who could find no reason for the failure. When he finally managed to sleep, he was troubled by a recurring image. A dark figure wearing night sight goggles and carrying a force projector? Could his subconscious hold a memory that the trauma of accident had wiped from his conscious mind? Perhaps it had not been an accident. No, the idea was ridiculous. He was just trying to shift the blame from chance and his own clumsiness. He hadn't actually been assaulted or robbed. Besides, what good did putting him in hospital do anybody? Weapons Tech First Class Tony Pandrel reporting for duty. She handed over her transfer documents to the boarding officer and waited patiently while he made an ID scan. "It'll just take a moment to check these through, Lieutenant," he said, starting to tap away at the lectern terminal that symbolically guarded the mouth of the boarding tube. Tony walked a few steps away and dropped her kit bag in front of the observation window. Against the slowly drifting background of stars, the broadsword hung like a great sable egg, speared by the Sky Station's docking arms. Tony cast a professional eye over the rings of blister pods that broke the smooth lines of the warship's skin, encircling its tail and midsection, and clustering thick about its nose. Force field nodes, missile tubes, energy projectors. Her domain. Two of the ship's flight bay hatches were open, shielded by glowing air curtains. As she watched, a flight of shuttles glided up to one of the hatches. For a moment, Tony seemed to lose herself in the scene before her. She blinked, then realized there was someone sharing the view. Turning slightly, she saw it was a man of compact build with a dark, thoughtful face and thick, black, curly hair. His uniform insignia were those of a broadsword flight lieutenant. Tony said quietly, "Quite a sight, isn't it?" The man smiled gently. "Do you mean the general notion of a starship preparing to head out into the big night for the final frontier, or the broadsword in particular?" he replied. She grinned back at him. "Both, probably. Either way, it's still something." He held out his hand. "Nicholas Court," he introduced himself, looking at her uniform insignia. "And you're the replacement for Manton, I suspect." "That's right. My lucky break, I guess." She drew in her breath sharply. "Sorry, no pun intended. Is he a friend of yours?" "Not specially. We're all still getting to know each other. A high proportion of first-timers on board. I believe Fleetcom think a new class of ship needs a fresh crew, or at least one not too set in their ways." Tony chuckled. "Keep going on like that, and I'll feel like a grizzled space veteran." "Oh, I see. What have you done?" "A tour on Adamant." "I would have thought that would have been enough to keep you busy." "Who put in for the transfer?" "Sorry, I'm prying." "Nothing to hide. The Adamant's a fine ship, and I was happy to serve on her. But when I heard about the broadsword, For a moment she hesitated, suddenly unsure of her motivation, which seemed so strong but oddly unfounded. Yet she seemed to remember Captain Farrack agreeing with her reasons when he approved her request. Then her doubt was gone, and she smiled and smoothly continued, "Thought it was a chance to work on a wider range of weapon systems than on the Adamant." "That, I think we can promise you," said Court positively. "You're cleared to go through now, Lieutenant Pandrel," said the boarding officer. He handed her a ship's pass and ident badge, then saluted formally. "Welcome aboard." Court walked beside Tony as she made her way along the tube. "Look," he said slowly, with what Tony thought was a hint of shyness. "I'd be happy to show you around later, if you like." She thought his reserve rather appealing. "Thanks, I'll take you up on that. But I think I'd better report to Commander Foss first, don't you?" He smiled brightly. "Sure, admin's on deck 2. They'll know where he is and sort out your accommodation." They passed through the hatchway into the broadsword, and he led the way to the central access core. "Oh yes," Court chuckled. "I'd better warn you about Doc Yoland. She wants the broadsword to have the fittest crew in the fleet." "Now, her medicals—" "That's all right," Pandrol interjected quickly. "Our doctor on the Adamant gave me a full checkup before I left. It's on my file." Her expression was set hard. Then she relaxed, smiling, seeming a little surprised by her own reaction. "Well, lucky you," replied Court with puzzled eyes. They rode the lift tube in silence for a moment. Then Tony started asking him about the rest of the senior officers, and the memory of her sharp response soon faded. 10 days later, he would recall the incident and understand. Too late, of course.
Thank you, as always, James. And now we're going to speak with the author. Chris has once again done some incredible, meticulous research, looking back to his original notes to see what he could find from when he was originally commissioned to do the novel, and he's going to share his memories and, of course, some readings, as he always does, which is great. So, over to you, Mr. Bulis.
My name is Christopher Bulis, and I wrote the new adventure Shadowmind.
Well, Chris, it's lovely to have you back and taking ourselves way back to where it all began. But of course, this wasn't your first piece of writing. Could you maybe tell us a few things that you'd written before Shadowmind?
Yeah, well, before then, I was working on an SF fantasy story of my own called Emerald of Greystaff, which I've been trying out with a few publishers. And none of them had taken it up, but I got enough positive feedback to encourage me to keep trying and refining the idea and my ability to tell a story. And then I found out about the new adventures and focused on getting a Doctor Who story accepted by Virgin Publishing. It's not that I thought I was a great writer, but I knew Doctor Who well, and I'd read or watched a lot of SF over the years, including a few Duff stories that had me exclaiming, well, I could do better than that. That's possibly where it started, I suppose, yeah.
Yeah. So what do you call about your submission to Virgin and how it changed before we got to the final version?
Well, I don't have any surviving correspondence from the time, which is quite a way back, but I think I initially tried out my old speculative screenplay for what later became a device of death out on them, but eventually somehow I settled on the basic premise of Shadowmind. The opening chapters and the synopsis were accepted, but it took a while for it finally to get commissioned because of scheduling problems. That was up to Virgin. Then I only had a few months to finish it and make some unplanned changes, because initially I'd set Shadowmind in the 28th century, which is based upon the future timeline in Jean-Marc L'Officier's very useful reference book, Doctor Who, The Terrestrial Index, which I've used before. But now it had to be brought back 100 years to fit in with the new adventure chronology, which Virgin were developing. Also, Ace had left and then came back again, with the character changed quite a bit. And also I had to write Bernice Summerfield into my story, which is annoying because since from my point of view, these are quite arbitrary changes. But that's all part of writing for an ongoing series where you have to integrate other people's work. At this point, I really must thank Virgin editor Peter Darvell Evans for guiding me through the process, which was after my first novel, and putting me right when the story veered off course a bit halfway through.
Oh, Peter's a good man. He knows what he wants and how to do it. So
yeah.
So how exciting was it for you as a fan to be involved in creating new Doctor Who? Because effectively, along with DWM and their comic strip, this was all that we had back then.
That was it, yes. It was quite something to involved with such a famous piece of television history, let's face it. And I'd enjoyed it since I was quite young. I won't say exactly how young, I was quite young when it started. And at least if somebody then asked me, what are you doing right now? They were impressed when I said I was writing a Doctor Who novel. Because even if they didn't watch it, they'd at least heard of it. Pretty well everybody'd heard of it. So that was something.
Yeah. So how did you go about the actual process of writing the novel, and how did you fit it around your real life?
Physically, and this is important, physically, I wrote it on old Brother WP1 word processor, which was shaped a bit like a very chunky regular typewriter with a carry handle and weighed about 14 kilos. It had a tiny monochrome screen, an integral daisy wheel printer, and a low-density floppy disk drive that needed 3 disks just to hold the whole book. As it had no ROM memory, no automatic editorial functions, or even a spell checker, so making corrections was sometimes tedious and fiddly. The WP1 was primitive, incredibly primitive by modern standards, and it let through some silly spelling mistakes and homonyms, but it was a heck of a lot faster to use than an old manual typewriter. As to fitting in writing Shadowmind around my real life, I was, back in the early 90s, selling by mail order a range of miniature building accessories that I created some years earlier for use in fantasy gaming and model making. Dungeons and Dragons, that sort of thing. So I was able to write in between filling orders for 25mm scale castles and dungeons and temples.
Do you know what, Chris? That was not the answer I was expecting, so there we go. Fantastic. So what was your starting point for the story, as you recall?
Well, now here, I have to be honest, I really cannot remember how it started. I mean, I must have had some initial idea, a seed, so to speak, that I was able to expand and develop into the final story, but it's long gone now. My initial motivation at the time was simply that I wanted to tell an entertaining SF story that would have as wide an appeal as possible. Incidentally, that's the reason my writing style is what it is, much to the apparent annoyance of some critics who thought it should be more adventurous in some way. The thing is, I wasn't striving to be modish or experimental or push literary boundaries. I was simply trying to be comprehensible and tell an entertaining story. And to me, that came first. Like much of SF, Doctor Who stories involve many unfamiliar scientific concepts, characters and settings that need to be explained clearly to readers for them to have any hope of following what is going on. So they shouldn't be obscured by any fancy or pretentious stylistics. Perhaps as I wrote later books, my writing style, such as it is, improved simply due to increased practice at weaving narratives and using the right word in the right place. But the essence of the story itself still comes first. One general principle I did start with was to try to emulate as far as practical a filmic style in my writing, by which I mean such things as quick cutting between scenes to build up pace. I was working on the assumption that most of my readers would have seen many of the films I had, and they would be aware that the pacing of film storytelling had been steadily accelerating over the years, ever since Doctor Who was last on screen, indeed. Perhaps subconsciously, they would be expecting the analogue of that in a book. That didn't mean, however, that the pace should be relentlessly frenetic without pause. Action should, in turn, contrast with scenes of necessary description and exposition to help set the mood and explain what's going on. Both are essential parts of the final story, and moving between them gives the story texture and depth as the pace and tension is built up and then relaxed.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. So how did you find writing for Benny? Given the Doctor and Ace were well established, did you have a voice in mind for her when you were putting finger to keyboard?
Yeah, the Doctor, the Seventh Doctor, and Ace, I knew. Benny was an original creation of the Virgin staff, so the guidelines from them were that she was a cross between Emma Peel and Emma Thompson. She was smart, independently minded, sarcastic and laconic. I did my best with that. She was useful when a bit of exposition was needed, or for making cutting remarks and tart observations. I tried to introduce her to my readers to get a measure of her character myself early on in the story, with a scene in the TARDIS between her and Ace, who had just worked out that this was her birthday. There was a knock at her door. Bernice Summerfield entered. Ace frowned at the expression on her face. "Something the matter?" she asked. Bernice came straight to the point. "Have you felt anything strange the last few minutes?" "What do you mean?" Bernice sighed. "I mean an odd emotion, a feeling that's not exactly your own, but makes you remember something from your past." Bernice's quick eyes read the sudden change of expression on her face. "Yes, I see you have." "All right, Sherlock," retorted Ace. "Yes, I have been thinking of the past. I've just worked out that today's my birthday. What of it?" "Congratulations, I'll bake your cake later. Meanwhile, if you've been getting the same sort of emotional stimuli as I have, then there really is some odd force loose in here." "Something dangerous?" "Perhaps not, but it's damn peculiar and uncomfortable." "Have you talked to the Professor?" "I tried to, but I don't think he wants me disturbed just now. That's why I'm here. You see, when I saw him in the control room, for a moment, it seemed as though he'd changed." Ace sprang to her feet, alarmed. "You mean he's regenerating? Mudbrain? Why did you say?" She rushed for the door, but Bernice grabbed her arm. "No, it wasn't actually different. It was an image, an illusion in my mind, I think. But for a moment he seemed so real, an old man with the doctor's eyes. Then he was back to normal again, except that he seemed so preoccupied and, well, sad. But I thought it best to leave him until I'd talked to you first. Does any of this make sense?" For a moment they faced each other, very different in appearance. Ace, small, compact, strong, looking fierce at the moment and tense as a coiled spring. Bernice, taller, older, equally strong, equally concerned, but more controlled, her expressive, sardonic face now thoughtful, her quirky mouth pursed and serious. "No," replied Ace after a moment, "but there are some fragging awful things that have gone wrong in here before." "So I remember," Bernice responded dryly. "But what I mean is..." Even as she spoke, another ripple of regret, mingled with weariness, seemed to discharge through them, almost like a build-up of static electricity being earthed. This time Ace recognised it for what it was. Old memories threatened to surface once again in her mind. For a moment, an image of Jan swam before her, then it was gone. She saw that Bernice had felt something similar. Bernice ran her fingers stiffly through her short, practical hairstyle and managed a wry smile. "The past," she observed, "is really a drag sometimes, isn't it?" "Yeah," Ace replied. For a moment there was a sense of fellow feeling between them. Two strong people, vulnerable only from within. Both wished the ghost of what had been to remain well buried. The Doctor takes them to the rich, comfortable and, apparently, safe world of Tengaya to celebrate Ace's birthday. "It's said here," Ace said, raising her voice over the noise of the crowd flowing past her, "that the lantern market of New Byzantium..." "Hey, what happened to old Byzantium?" "Byzantium is the original name of Constantinople," Bernice informed her, "named after the Emperor Constantine. That was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire until the 15th century, when it was captured by the Turks and later renamed Istanbul." Ace got back in again. "Thanks for the lecture, Professor, I remember now." And here is Benny being perceptive and witty. Returned to shore in the afternoon, they spent a few hours in the Unreality Park, which, Ace decided, left laser light shows and 100-track sound system standing. It was entirely frivolous and probably very juvenile and extremely silly, and she loved it. Perhaps you had to grow up a little before you appreciated simple pleasures. Bernice, who had obviously been observing her closely, had said, "Yes, simple pleasures are wasted on the young. They're not old enough to appreciate them." "Cynic," Ace had retorted with a smile. "I like to keep in practice," Bernice had replied.
I like that. It's very hard. I can hear Lisa Bowerman saying that very much so, very much in that style. So yes, that's perfect Benny to my mind. So, of course, we've talked about our heroes there, and the villain of the piece is Umbra, not to be confused with Umbro Sportswear. And I remember Umbra being quite impressive first time around, when it was like the first thing I was thinking of, what do I remember about this book? Umbra and the squirrels. So how do you enjoy creating something like that? And of course, we then have its duplicates throughout, which certainly throw us and confuse us.
Well, yes, Umbra, the Shadowmind of the title, was meant to be sinister, of course. You have to have a good villain in an adventure story. I recall some reviewer suggesting it was a rip-off of the menacing spaceborne intelligence of the film Quatermass 2 from 1957. I had seen the film some years earlier, but any similarity was certainly unintentional. The physical manifestation of Umbra is a kind of flowing, organised carbon mass, looking very like a shadow when spread out flat. It begins advancing through the woods of Arden towards a human settlement guarded by a contingent of space marines. Casal paced along his section of the perimeter of Touchstone's cluster of domes. The work lights behind him cast his long shadow across the broad stretch of open ground to the forest, where it merged with the shadows of the forest thrown back by the glow of the fires. He fingered the trigger of his rifle, preset for a broad beam burn, and eyed the distance to the first line of scrub at the forest edge, a good clear 110 metres at least. Nothing was going to cross that before he could burn it. His helmet radio broadcast Ashton's voice. 5-minute check. Perimeter, Brant, all quiet. Casal, yo. Quan, here, Sarge. The check ran down the list. Casal reached the end of his section, turned and paced back again. There was still activity behind him between the outer domes and the main one, but he didn't let it distract him. His eyes didn't leave the edge of the forest and the open ground, and his shadow marching across it in giant strides. Funny, it was darker than it had been. He heard the whispering rush of the shadow form as a thin tongue of its substance raced along his own shadow. Sarge! His rifle was burning into stream as it flowed over his feet and up his body. There was an electric flash. I only realised as I was working on this podcast that an adversary superficially not unlike the manifestation of Umbra was depicted on screen many years later. The Doctor, Donna, River Song and a party of archaeologists are menaced by the creeping shadows of the carnivorous Vashta Nerada in the Series 4 Episode 8 story Silence in the Library. Towards the end of Shadowmind, the Doctor opens radio communications with Umbra. Umbra, can you hear me? We would like to speak to you. There's no point in hiding any longer, because we know where you are. Your plan has failed. You can't win, so it's time to talk peaceably. There was no response. One load of shadow material and hypergems isn't enough. You haven't the power to move your mind core yet, and the fleet will be here in a few days, so why not talk and prevent more suffering? For a long moment there was nothing. Then, Umbra is strong. Umbra will win. Bernice shivered. The Doctor would be right. There was an eerie, petulant quality in the voice that she associated with skinned knees and shrill belligerence. But not strong enough or big enough, responded the Doctor, just as though reasoning with a child. The Shen won't run the duplicates for you anymore, and your shadows on Arden are being hunted down and destroyed by Marines. You've lost. What will you do with Umbra? Suddenly the voice sounded wheedling and anxious. The Doctor looked at the others, his expression grave. If it was up to me, I would not hurt Umbra, but I would not allow Umbra to grow further until it had learned responsibility and was sorry for what it had done. Stop Umbra growing? For now, yes. No! Umbra wants to grow now, the thing bawled. Not to be alone anymore, to be big, to be everywhere, to touch things and make more of Umbra. No, said the Doctor firmly, you'll have to be patient. You must grow within before you can grow without. We're taking away your toys, added Ace. There was a silence. Then, Umbra knows something you don't know. Suddenly it sounded sly and cunning. The Marshal interrupted. What do you know? If you don't let Umbra grow now, Umbra can hurt you. We can't let you grow, Umbra, said the Doctor. Then Umbra will hurt you. In my mind at the time, I'd imagined a literal, spoilt adolescent voice for Umbra. But it was only after I reread the story and was selecting excerpts for this podcast that a potential new voice came into my mind for that role. The one who had not been so well known when I wrote Shadowmind, certainly not on this side of the Atlantic. Petulant, childish, but also powerful and manipulative, sometimes speaks in the third person, promotes both a sense of victimhood and entitlement, possibly harbours megalomaniacal ambitions. Remind you of anybody who's been in the news a lot lately? Umbra's agents are human duplicates. Replicants and doppelgangers of all sorts have been featured in SF writing for a long time. Perhaps they were most famously portrayed on screen in Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1955, and also I Married a Monster from Outer Space from 1958. The extra twist with my duplicates is they don't know that they've been duplicated. I tried to convey to the reader some sense of this nightmarish situation earlier on in the story. Botanist Jerry Ostman, newly returned from Arden and staying in New Byzantium on Teangire, thinks he's going mad. His day had gone wrong from the start. He distinctly recalled intending to visit the Xenobotanic Gardens, and somehow he found himself in the Central Library, knowing he'd been searching the references, but unable to remember why he'd been doing so or what he'd been looking for. He left in a dazed state of mind, wondering if he'd experienced some sort of blackout, and thinking seriously about finding a doctor when there was another blank, and he found himself leaving a public building, the office of somebody important, he was sure, knowing that he had been asking questions about them without the slightest idea why he'd been doing so. Really frightened, he looked around for help and seen a patrolman, the uniform had never seemed so reassuring, and had started to walk towards him intending to ask for help. And then it was half an hour later, and he found himself sitting at a table in a quiet walkway restaurant. Desperately, he tried to ask the people at the next table for help. The words would not come. And then another blank, and it was an hour later. He was leaving another office building with the impression he'd been making inquiries about important people, but he still couldn't remember why. At some point in the nightmare, he'd become aware that he was being followed, and then his moments of lucid thought between the blackouts had become briefer and more disjointed. He could remember starting to run, although he did not know from whom or what, and the terrifying thought came to him that he might be a criminal suffering from memory loss. Why couldn't he go to the police if he was an honest citizen? Perhaps it was the police following him. And then his mind blanked out again. When he recovered this time, he saw the lights of the market. Here he was. He forced himself to sit quietly. Every time he tried to ask for help, his mind had blanked out. Perhaps if he just waited until the right person walked past close enough, he could ask them calmly, rationally, for medical aid without pushing himself over the brink again. Some children ran past him, laughing, batting a large red balloon ball between them. He tried to draw reassurance from their innocent pleasure, waiting for somebody more suitable. He felt absurdly deserted at the edge of the crowded square. Why didn't someone come? His thin veneer of calm was slipping away. He scanned the nearest line of stalls, hoping to catch someone's eye, but all their attention seemed to be on buying and selling. No, there was one young woman, dressed in black, looking at him. For a moment he relaxed his control and let the fear inside show on his face. The woman is Ace, of course, who is about to become embroiled in the mystery. After a pursuit through the back streets, she has a fight with the men trailing Osman, which she resolves with a few neo-nitro sweet bombs, but she is too late to save him. The body of the man Ace had first seen on the bench in the market lay where it had fallen. His head and shoulders doubled up against the ivy-topped wall, his right arm still reaching above him, fingers entwined in the trailing strands. She saw an intelligent, thoughtful face, surrounded by a head of blonde hair, cut in a practical, conservative style because the owner had more important things to think about than fashion. The face was frozen in a rictus of surprised death, the eyes open and focused on infinity. There was a scorched and smoking fist-sized hole in his chest. Ace stared down at him, and for the first time felt the familiar sense of sickness and anger swell within her. This was it, the reality after the action. The big payoff when the exciting bit was over. She felt for a pulse in the big carotid artery of the neck without hope. Nothing. "Sorry I couldn't get here sooner, mate," she murmured regretfully. Then the dead eyes turned to look at her, and a dead hand grasped her arm in a vice-like grip. The body jerked up, the mouth twisted to form words. "Drowning!" he gasped. And then his features relaxed into a terrible calm, and he sank back. Ace struggled to free herself from that unnatural hold, then froze, choking in horror, as a small, bloody, blackened thing pulled itself half out of the hole in the man's chest, and then lay still. She tore free, pale and trembling. She scrabbled on hands and knees across the roadway until she rested against the far wall, hugging her shins, staring with fearful eyes at the body. She hadn't moved when the doctor Bernice found her a few minutes later. A Shen duplicate had been exposed for the first time, and that sets the scene for what is to come. Instantly, you could see the revelation of a tiny alien-controlling creature nested inside an apparently dead human body played out on screen in a not unrelated way a few years later in the 1997 film The First Men in Black.
Yeah, that's true. That's funny. I rewatched that recently and saw a clip of that on the TV. And yes, that is exactly. So they ripped it off. Let's sue Will Smith for all the money he has.
To be fair, I don't think they ripped me off. It was just a similar idea being played out. But as I said, only after I'd thought of this and I thought, wait a minute, that seems familiar. Where have I seen it? No. It was after I wrote it, yeah. But there we are.
You never know. But before I reread it, as mentioned earlier, I did remember the bush tails, the alien squirrels, which I thought was a great imagery because it's something that we can relate to, and it's something that the TV show's done a lot when it's come back with the likes of Jadoon, the cat people, and everything else.
It was a lot easier now, isn't it? A lot easier to make realistic virtual aliens and not people in suits. So yes. Do you like that? I'm glad you like the squirrels, because I start and end the story with scenes involving the same two characters, Robson and Rusty, his pet bushtail and native of Arden. I want to suggest a peaceful world, seemingly free from care, with a human and alien existing in harmony. A cute, furry animal seemed like a nice place to start. The bushtail chirruped impatiently as Donald Robson followed him up the path between the great trunks of the spire cones. "All right, Rusty, I'm coming," replied Robson. "Remember, this is work for me, even if it's no more than a scamper in the woods for you." Squatting back on its haunches, the bushtail raised its forepaws from the ground to hold them curled neatly against its chest and regarded Robson through blackberry bright eyes, now level with the man's waist. "Chirrup, chip, chip, choo," it ventured, its great golden red billow of a tail forming a question mark as though in emphasis. "That's right," confirmed Robson. "Another survey point." The bushtail sat patiently, watching Robson drive the sampler staff into the ground, as though indulging a friend engaged in an amusing, although incomprehensible task. He gave his usual chick of satisfaction after the electronic package built into the staff beeped when the sample was taken. Of course, there was an unseen danger lurking in those apparently idyllic woods.
Indeed there was, but we're not going to go into that now. Go and read the book, people. Go and find it, read it. It's available at a good price still online. So something else in the book are a lot of characters, and that's something that in your later works there's definitely fewer people to try and work out who they are there. So is that something that you learned from with this book and going forward, and what else did it teach you?
Yeah, well, I can state very clearly right now there were far too many characters in Shadowmind. And this is partly because I was daunted by the prospect of having to write a whole novel of 75 to 85,000 words, and I felt that I had to fill it with as many characters as possible to give me more material to work with. I hadn't appreciated at the time. You're free to have a cast of thousands in the background, but you must limit the number of speaking parts to a minimum. I soon discovered that you are more likely to hit your maximum word count if you are working under one before you finish a story, and usually you have to trim down and tighten up a text. Also, I'd not then worked out how to make one character serve more than a single function in moving the plot along. This also saves words and maintains the pace later on by not having to introduce somebody new to the reader. In parallel with the problem of having too many characters in a story is that of having too many locations for similar reasons. Each new setting has to be described, and that takes time and space. Of course, this is all part of establishing the mood of the story, and very important earlier on, but it becomes a liability towards the end, especially of an action-adventure type story, when you are probably building up to a spectacular climax and don't want to undermine the momentum by pausing for a new bit of scene setting. Otherwise, I learned that once you've accepted in advance for writing a book, you've got to deliver the goods on time.
Most definitely do. I can vouch for that. Deadlines, they're there for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
They're not, unless you're Douglas Adams, then those things that whiz past.
Yes. He waved to them apparently as they passed him by, very cheerfully. But he was given a lot of leeway because he was Douglas Adams, when I don't think I'd have ever been given that much leeway. Yeah.
Well, I can recommend this book, Chris.
Oh,
42.
Fantastic. Look at that.
By Kevin Davis, 42, Douglas Adams, and it's a collection of many of the things that were in Douglas's archive that were donated to Cambridge University, and I just picked this up last week, so heartily recommended.
Oh, right, I'll try to find a copy myself. Yes, great. 42.
Yes, that's the one.
Yes, we all know the answer. If only we know what the question was, we'd be happy. Yeah.
How many bush tails does it take to... No, we're not.
Don't go into that. Obviously, there we are. You may have cracked it. Yes.
So, looking back on Shadowmind now, how do you feel about it having reread it?
Well, the production of it certainly formed a very steep learning curve, which I just about managed to climb. Overall, I think you can call Shadowmind an adequate book. Not bad for a first effort sort of thing. The basic plot was sound enough. It had a few exciting moments, featured a certain amount of creativity, which made for a reasonably entertaining read. I interwove quite a number, too many really, of parallel story threads, locations and characters, and brought them together in the end in a logical and fairly satisfying fashion. But it could have been far better for the reasons I've already mentioned. I did make one modest contribution to what might be called the New Adventures canon in Shadowmind. This was in the creation of the first galactic bank, with which Inspector Quillian discovers the Doctor has unlimited credit. That implies he had vast resources behind him, which of course he has, and which extends far beyond a big heap of money. Now that phrase was inspired by an incident on a radio adaptation of The Count of Monte Cristo that I'd heard. In it, Edmond Dantes, travelling about the country while taking revenge on those who had had him falsely imprisoned, presents a letter from his bank to a local bank that simply says he has unlimited credit because it's backed by the vast Monte Cristo treasure. That really impresses the local bankers. I felt it was logical that the Time Lords would set something up like this for the benefit of travelling Gallifreyans who need to mingle with the locals for a length of time. I recall being told not long after Shadowmind came out that another author was going to use it in his story. I also gave Ace's combat suit, which version had provided a sketch and description of, a helmet with various integral cybernetic augmentations, which I felt was an appropriate finishing touch. I portrayed her wearing it in full combat gear on a cover I did for the Celestial Toy Room. In the book, I said it had been cut from the dome of a Dalek Supreme, which is quite a trophy. In the final analysis, Shadowmind, although far from perfect, was at least good enough to convince the people at Virgin to let me write another one. And for that, I am very grateful.
Brilliant. And of course, you got to do the cover for this one. So what was it like designing and managing the editorial changes?
Yeah, I did. I offered to do the cover for my book, and almost to my surprise, Virgin accepted, perhaps for the novelty value, or because they'd already agreed to the same idea for Lucifer Rising, with a Jim Mortimer cover. And originally, I did 3 colour roughs of scenes I thought involved eye-catching action. Ace in a back lane of New Byzantium fighting Shen duplicates with neo-nitrous suites. The Doctor, Benny and Ace under energy gunfire, escaping from a military transporter that had been hijacked by duplicates. And Ace in her battle suit in the sculpture park where the TARDIS had landed, shooting at a duplicate soldier wearing a flight pack. Realising then that I hadn't offered a cover featuring Arden, I did a 4th, showing Benny and Sergeant Santoni in combat gear crouching down behind a tree on the edge of a forest glade, watching colonists being forced by duplicates to feed wood into the mysterious kilns. It was the least dynamic of the set, with a lot of fiddly background detail. I only added it really for balance. Naturally, that was the one my editors chose. But then they asked for some modifications, wanting me to show Benny without a combat helmet, which is not true to the text and was rather unrealistic in the circumstances, and also turn more towards the viewer to show her face. They also wanted me to light the foreground because it was too dark for a good cover image, or so they thought, although that dark arch of foliage and tree trunks was there intentionally to help frame the rest of the scene. Now, I complied, but I think the picture lost quite a bit of dynamic contrast and atmosphere in the process. Now, the end result was not terrible, but it could have been a lot better. Might have been why I was never asked to do any more. You can see the colour roughs and other illustrations related to Shadowmind in David Howe's Who Adventures, which is a very good reference book.
It is indeed. It's excellent. And of course, it's how we came to be in touch in the first place. So
absolutely.
Good old David. A lovely man. And it is a great book. Highly recommended for anyone with an interest in the new and missing adventures. And of course, there's your lovely work for A Device of Death in there as well.
That as well. Yes, yeah. It all backs this up. Essential reference for the podcast, use goods. Yeah, yeah. That's it.
There you go. You did your prep for this years ago before you even knew of me. So that's what I call advanced and prepared. So another thing that we could say about this book is that there's a fair bit of an influence from Star Trek films and TV. So was that something that was deliberate, particularly when it came to the space battles?
Yeah. By the time I wrote Shadowmind in the early years of the 90s, I had seen a lot of space battles on both the large and small screen. Obviously, the first Star Wars trilogy set a new benchmark for realism, while the original Star Trek series spin-off films, which had been helped into being initially because of the success of Star Wars, showing there was an audience for big screen SF in the late 70s, continued that trend. It had just finished as I was writing Shadowmind, while Star Trek The Next Generation was still running on TV. Now, Shadowmind was an action-adventure story that took place partly in space, with a space-based adversary, so logically, it should also involve some space battles. Well, why not? They're fun and dynamic, and since they'd only take place on paper, I had, so to speak, unlimited budget for special effects. However, I did have some reservations about certain details in the depictions of space battles I had seen, so this would also be my chance to do them properly, as I felt. This wasn't simply a personal indulgence. I had the notion that making them and the procedures aboard my starship as authentic as possible would also add verisimilitude to my story. Broadly speaking, there are two main categories of space battle. First, there is combat between big ships, the equivalent of naval cruisers and battleships or dreadnoughts, with some also serving the function of aircraft carriers. The original Star Trek series Enterprise, by the way, was classed as a heavy cruiser. The second category of space warfare involves combat between fighters. Basically, this means restaging World War II, or Top Gun if you want to be a bit more up-to-date, aerial warfare in space with lasers instead of bullets. Indeed, when George Lucas was assembling the first cut of Star Wars and all the effect shots were not ready, he supposedly filled in with snippets of Cold War films, and he even used some archive shots to choreograph his combat scenes. But there are problems with drawing too heavily on such familiar source material. Travelling through space is not like traversing earthly skies, not just because, famously, nobody can hear you scream, but for related reasons. In close space combat, if it ever happens, in any form remotely similar to that portrayed on screen, then things would happen fast. Too fast for a traditional captain on the bridge to react to changing circumstances and give verbal commands to helmsmen and weapons controllers. Before they can react, it would all be over. So, enter my creation, the CSS Broadsword. It's classed as an assault ship, meaning it will carry an armoured unit and their landing craft to a trouble spot and provide them with aerospace support, together with its own fighter wing. It hasn't got the sleek, exciting lines of the Enterprise. See the illustration on page 88 of the Who Adventures for a glimpse of it. But I think it's a more practical design. And in a combat situation, its key command crew mentally linked together to operate the ship. I've described it as I built up the tension before a potential combat situation. Kosama looked about the Broadsword's bridge, her bridge. An arc of control consoles and screens with a low dais in its focus. Set on this dais, facing outwards, were 4 heavy command chairs, each appearing humped back with the bulge of a retracted interface helmet. There was a place for the captain, offensive and defensive weapons officers, and the pilot. Together they would become the mind of the ship. She sensed the atmosphere, tense and expectant, but everyone went about their task with outward quiet efficiency. She was proud of them. For most, it would be their first taste of combat. When combat is imminent, they take their places. Command team to positions, ordered Kasama, ready for computer interface, manual controls to standby. Pilot Commander Estival took her place in the fourth command chair. Kasama touched a control on her chair panel, and a force field shimmered into life about the dais. All right, helmets on. Power arms lifted the helmets over the back of the chairs and down over their heads, cutting off the sights and sounds of the bridge. Kasama felt the helmet automatically link with the terminal at the base of the skull. There was the expected moment of total isolation, as her own body senses were bypassed and disengaged. Her senses merged with the ship as the team found their places in the control matrix. She could feel their thought process accelerating beyond that of any unaided human mind, allowing them to control the combat functions of the broadsword more precisely and more rapidly than any old-time commander could ever have dreamed possible. I applied the same principles to fighter combat. Their pilots also mentally merge with their craft. The stealth-contoured Midnight Black fighter pulled out of its attack run and headed out for the stars at maximum acceleration. The crater-pitted surface of the dead moon fell away behind it, the horizon contracting and bowing into a ragged arc. 3 pinpoints of light swelled into brilliance on the ash plain below and slowly faded. Target strike confirmed, said the computer running the war game. End of attack phase. Nice shooting, guys, said Lieutenant Kim Talavera. She had not spoken the words, she had thought them. A fighter comm system had translated them into a tight-beamed maser pulse and transmitted it to her wingmen. In the same way, she had not touched a control during the whole flight. In fact, she could hardly move. People were always asking her what that was like. I tell you, she would say, there's nothing like it. You are the bird when you fly one of these, just you in command solo, and all your senses are boosted through the onboard systems. You think in fast time, you see right through from infrared to ultraviolet, and you hear the radio bands, and you're riding 10G acceleration in the cocoon. But it's as though you're naked to the stars and your body is bigger and better and stronger. Yeah, it's a power high. Ask any pilot. There's also one other manoeuvre you can do in space that is impossible in atmosphere, which I wrote into Shadowmind. Kim heard the missile's scan beam lock on as she finished her second attack run. She pulled a tight evasive loop and strewed her weight with chaff bouquets and radar decoys. The missile ignored them, still closing. Damn thing has got me on visual tracking, she thought. She engaged max and boost and dropped a spread of micromines. Fireballs erupted behind her, and she heard the pseudo sound of explosions. She looked back. It was still there, still closing. In accelerated time, Kim scanned the projectile closely. It was no simple interceptor missile, but a multifunction homing torpedo, shielded. Time for Plan B, she thought, cutting a drive and tumbling through 180 degrees. Thank you, vacuum, she elated, where flying arse backwards doesn't matter. All her forward projectors now zeroed in on the torpedo. She poured fire into it until its nose cone glowed, burning out its control systems, and it veered away from her. Its drive flickered, failed. Now, to my knowledge, I have never seen or read about such a trick in SF at that time. It was not until some years later I saw it portrayed on screen in an episode of the revamped 2004 series of Battlestar Galactica, when Apollo's fighter performed such a flip. Did I do it first? Anyway, those are my, possibly, original contributions to the depiction of space warfare.
Fantastic. I think you definitely did get there ahead of Apollo. So, yeah, I think that should be known as the Bulis manoeuvre from now on.
Could go alongside the Picard manoeuvre. Oh, exactly. Yes, great.
Works for me. So, when you were writing this one, of course, the show had a fabled TV viewership of people between the age of 8 and 80. But, of course, Ace is in a state of disrobe on a couple of occasions. So, do you feel it worked as intended, and how innovative and mature do you think you can be in written Doctor Who?
Well, the brief from Virgin was to go beyond televised Doctor Who and write not only for existing fans who would, one suppose, have grown up a bit more since Doctor Who had been off the air, but also for a slightly more mature audience. And yet, I didn't want to put off any new younger readers. Was that fabled 8 to 80 age band of viewership, as it supposedly achieved on TV, still actually achievable in text, or was that already in the past? It was an awkward balance to maintain, and which I remain conscious of throughout my time writing Doctor Who stories. Shadowmind touched on aspects of mature relationships, had instances of violent death and self-sacrifice, but set within an otherworldly context which perhaps removed a little from stark reality. Of course, that was only what Doctor Who had done from the beginning. I tried to make them believable, but not overly gory, and I had other characters responding appropriately. As the couple of times where Ace is naked, that would not, of course, have been portrayed on TV, but those instances did hopefully imply, without being in any way salacious, that this was a more adult story. The first occurred at night in the sculpture park where the TARDIS is parked when Ace is being hunted by a squad of duplicate soldiers. Temporarily incapacitated by a grazing stun beam shot, she hides in plain sight by stripping off, streaking her body with dirt, and posing amongst a group of marble, life-size nude statues. I had to set the scene up carefully, with Ace having already discovered earlier in the day, apparently quite inconsequentially, that the statues, due to some whim of their creator, were at body temperature. It was a mini problem-solving exercise and a chance for the reader to guess what she'd done before it was revealed. It also showed Ace being smart enough to use a daring deception rather than open confrontation to Smythe, which she might not have done a few years earlier. Ace is held still while a duplicate soldier passed close by and waited until she was safely out of sight. Slowly, very slowly, she broke her pose. Crouching down, she rubbed her leg vigorously, squeezing the calf muscle and flexing her ankle. Carefully extricating herself from the figure group, Ace catapulted over the wet grass and retrieved her bulging backpack from the hedge. Should she dress now? Or would she need the statue dodge a second time? And had she the sheer chutzpah to carry it off? Were there still soldiers on the perimeter? What would happen when they drew in their net and found it empty? The muffled thumps of a repeating grenade launcher brought her answer. As a projectile whistled overhead, she rammed on her helmet, image intensified mode coming on automatically as she pulled down the visor. Slinging her pack, she started to run, pistol in hand, in the direction of the park boundary and the street beyond. Something struck the ground to her right and burst with a rushing hissing noise. Gas! Probably not lethal, but she was not going to risk finding out. She ran and ran. And then a soldier stepped out into a brick archway in the hedge before her. He must have seen her just on the edge of his field of vision, for he twisted suddenly, rifle coming down to target, and hesitating for a fraction of a second in surprise at the naked figure wearing a Dalek-style helmet who was sprinting towards him. Ace fired 3 rapid shots. The second struck his chest, the third his visor. She leapt over the body without breaking stride and hurtled through the archway. Gravel pricked her bare feet, and the low wall dividing the perimeter pathway from the narrow shoreline of the street was before her. She vaulted the wall. Pebbles and loose shells sprayed up as she hit the tiny beach and rolled into the water. Half wading, half swimming, Ace surged through the shallows towards the dark rocks that formed a humped and ragged line marching out into the strait. Amongst these she found a niche in chest-deep water, out of sight of the shore path. She slipped off the pack and wedged it clear of the water, and then clung to the rocks, panting. Exhaustion was claiming her. There had been too many battles and jolts of adrenaline at the end of a long day. It was good that the water was half supporting her, she thought, because otherwise she'd probably fall over. The second scene was set in the underground Shen nest on Arden, where they have taken her to heal when the military attempt at making a stealthy landfall on Arden goes badly wrong, and she was forced to make an emergency bailout and had a bad landing. She is naked and exposed on a bizarre living treatment bed for hundreds of the little aliens, but she soon adjusts to the circumstances. Her nudity meant nothing to them, so there's no point in feeling embarrassed. It shows she's matured and adjusted to strange encounters and emphasises more readily with alien perspectives. I think those scenes work as intended, at least I don't recall any specific criticism of them.
No, neither do I. So, of course, once you've done all the hard work, you've done the cover, it comes to the publication, and there you go, the joy of seeing your name in print. And, of course, with that also comes the fact that you're being exposed to the public, and those Doctor Who fans who are, of course, they're very kind in their praise. They like everything, or perhaps not.
Yes. Eventually, Shadowmind got published, and I received my grafted pack of 20 copies from Virgin. Hooray! And there was my name in genuine print on the front cover. And I was able to give them away to family and friends. I was a real author at last. Shadowmind appeared on the bookshelves, and for a few weeks I found as many excuses as possible to lurk in my local WH Smith's, apparently perusing titles in a different section while surreptitiously observing people looking at the Doctor Who shelf. I hoped to spot somebody actually buying my book, but I never did. The downside of being a published author was, of course, having to run the gauntlet of the reviews. Now, for Shadowmind, they were mixed. Most people had a few good things to say about it, but the consensus seemed to be there was too much action centred around my characters and not enough about the TARDIS crew. That was justified for the reasons I've already mentioned, and I took that and other reasonable comments on board and tried to apply them to later books. I do recall one reviewer finding some detail of my story at odds with the immediately preceding adventure White Darkness, which he was sure I'd read because it was briefly alluded to earlier on in my story, and condemning me for this apparently calamitous error. What he did not know was that I knew nothing about the content of White Darkness, and the mention of it was only added by my editors at the last minute to give a sense of continuity between stories. As I got more familiar with reviews, I tried to learn from valid criticism, but also felt some people were picking on small details which offended their personal taste, which they then used to justify broader general condemnation. Occasionally, reviewers made factual errors, and I was moved to respond to them, but I'm not sure it was worth the effort. Sometimes it even felt as if reviewers were deliberately setting out to find fault in a story and then revelling in a display of their powers of perception, nitpicking and triumphal condemnation. Unfortunately, they did subtly instill in me a certain reciprocal snippiness and defensiveness, and I began picking holes in other people's work far too readily, which, looking back on those instances, I now regret. In the end, it's easy to get downcast over a negative review in any circumstances. My advice now, both to myself and others in similar situation, is not to get angry, but to take a step back and take a deep breath and try not to let it get you down. After all, it's not the end of the world. The Doctor takes care of that.
Most certainly does. And of course, Chris, you've got to remember, at the end of the day, you're the guy who's got a good significant number of book credits to your name, so you must have done something right first time around to keep coming back.
As I said, I did just enough. It wasn't a terrific beginning. It was just about okay. And I said, Virgin said, yeah, okay, give him another go at it. And I got, I think, a little bit better in the next one. So, yeah, it's reasonable. That's how these things progress. And here I am now. So yes, it's something. It wasn't. It worked out in the end. Not as I would have. I said, give me a chance now. Would you like to rewrite Shadowmind? Oh yes, I'd love to rewrite Shadowmind, and I would do it properly. And there'd be various changes and trimmings and contractions, and just give the whole thing an extra polish, and lots of little words here and there which weren't right at the time, and which, because of my very primitive word processor, it didn't pick up as being errors and didn't bring them to my attention. And I just read what I expected to read, and there we are. They got through. Some got through into print. Even my editors didn't notice all of them. But to be fair, that's not their job. They assume the book should be fairly grammatically correct from the start. They're not really there to pick up on small errors, so they still creep through. I found a few in the text when I was finding bits to copy for this podcast. There are a few. I said, well, what's that doing there? That doesn't. No, that's a wrong word. Nobody else noticed that. It still got through. But there we are. Anyway.
The benefit of hindsight. Well, talking of other work, I have literally just had a message from Steve Cole, your old BBC Books boss, and he says, I have to send you his very best regards. So
that's very kind of him. Thank you, Steve. Yes.
He'll be listening. He always listens into these. So.
That's very nice. Well, at some point we'll be moving. I think we done all the Virgin ones now.
We have
moving on. So if you want to do more, it's moving into BBC territory, isn't it?
It is indeed. It would be the ultimate treasure next, if you fancy that.
In order, that was the first one after.
That was the first one you did after the switch over.
Best to tackle them in order. So there it is, the ultimate treasure. We shall see. Yes.
Okay. Well, we shall reconvene in the near future.
Okay. Right. I'll start thinking about that. Got to give that a reread to think, did I write that? Oh dear.
We'll give you some time off for good behaviour, Chris, before we come back to it.
Okay. Yeah.
Cheers again.
Anyway, thank you. It's been great fun as always.
Thank you once again to Chris. Absolutely meticulous in his research and always a pleasure to speak to him. Genuinely one of the nicest people I've ever had the pleasure of interviewing. So thank you, Chris. And we'll hopefully hear from you very, very soon. So something he just mentioned there was reviews. And let's have a look to see what Doctor Who magazine had to say about Shadowmind. And this was published in issue 201. Strangely enough, they did the review before they published the prelude. Anyway, it's from Craig Hinton, and this is one of his earliest reviews. And it's actually really hard to read because it's got the Shadowmind cover in the background with the text set on top of it. But hey, that's 90s desktop publishing for you. So what did Craig have to say? After White Darkness's unremarkable Peter Elson cover, Shadowmind features one painted by the author, Christopher Bulis. Well, shades of love and war, I'm afraid. What I can only assume is Benny is drawn in an unconvincing Japanese anime style, completely out of proportion, backed by the hives of Arden. The what? Then I shall explain all. Yet another return to Earth's future history, circa the 27th century, as the TARDIS lands on Tairn Gair, part of the Concordance, an offshoot of the Empire. Before Ace can enjoy much of her treat, it's her birthday, she is caught up in an almost gangland killing. But neither the victim nor his assassins is truly human. Offering his service to the Tairn Gairians, the Doctor is accepted into the fold, spearheading, I use the word deliberately, their search for the origin of insidious replicas, which have replaced key members of the population. The scene is set for true space opera, Star Trek style, as Ace, Benny and the Doctor set off for the arboreal planet Arden on the starship Broadsword. This book has some lovely touches. The Doctor's easy acceptance is not due to his powers, but his credentials, namely unlimited credit in the First Galactic Bank, and a signed disposition from the Draconian Emperor. Benny doesn't really get a lot to do, apart from acting as a foil for both Ace and the Doctor, but this is where Perivale's finest comes into her own. Forget Nitro 9 and say hello to Sweet Bombs, explosive bullseyes. See Ace fight off armed replicants with nothing but her ingenuity and skill. Thrill as she uncovers the secret horror of Arden. Although I got quite a buzz out of Shadowmind, I love space battles and the Broadsword's dogfight above the surface of Arden is spectacular. I can't help feeling that it is a little too biased towards Ace. Yet again the Doctor is smugly one step ahead, while Benny slips towards cipherdom, leaving the real action to Ace. The book is full of well-rounded people, all with convincing personalities, but it's not the gut gripper that Lucifer Rising or Love and War were. The reasons are twofold. The Shen, original natives of Arden, are derivative and downright silly at times, but, worst of all, when this month's aeons-old horror is revealed, one casts one's mind back to the 50s and a certain ancestor of Doctor Who. I'm all for paying homage to other SF classics. Indeed, the Broadsword is not too dissimilar to the USS Enterprise, but only if a lot of originality is added to the mix. In Shadowmind, I guessed the location of Umbra, Chief Nasty, 100 pages before the end, based entirely on memories of that creaky old classic, and I doubt I'll be the only one. Shadowmind is vastly superior to offerings such as The Pit and Transit, but after 3 real blockbusters, it's a bit of a letdown. A bit of a mixed bag there from Craig Hinton, who could be notoriously brutal. Let's see what they have to say about it over on Goodreads, where the book has a rating of 2.89 from 230 ratings, and there's 31 reviews. 9% are 5 stars, 13% are 4 stars, 43% 3 stars, 23% 2 stars, and 10% are 1 star. Let's have a look and see what some of the reviews have to say. Here's one from Numa Parrot, who says 5 stars. Finally, a really good 7th Doctor novel. This one has cool aliens, great local characters, and even a pretty original plot. The whole story was fast-paced and imaginative. Granted, there was a lot of sitting around and discussing battle tactics, but the author handled it surprisingly well. Normally I hate reading about battles and military strategies. Did I mention the aliens were cool? They were amazing! Ace and Bernice have some interesting stuff going on. Ace finds plenty of time to be a badass while still pausing to have some deeper moments. Bernice has all her usual snark. The fact that the Doctor knew everything that was going on and was basically the sole engine of plot exposition could have gone terribly wrong, but somehow it seems credible enough that he randomly knew everything. That's just Seven, I guess. He waltzes in and knows everything. Christopher M gave it a 4-star review. He said, "My favourite so far. A bit of police procedural, a bit of Star Trek, and a strangely prescient bit of Avatar in an original sci-fi plot that holds together well. Too many characters, but you can't have everything." There's another 4-star review from Gareth. Gareth says, "Underrated. This one revolves around psychic spies and strange symbiotic aliens, and has some great ideas. The plot is very satisfying, upping the stakes irrevocably at one point. It's great when a story has a serious 'oh snap' moment. There's some very enjoyable description of a world and its bizarre aliens, who may or may not be malevolent, and a fun opening where the Doctor and co have a holiday. It's been criticised for the Doctor embracing a role in the military, but I don't think it strays outside his character. The final villain is the most simplistic thing here, so the ending isn't perfect. Overall though, an enjoyable read." Here's John Smith, presumably not the Doctor, and he's given it a 3-star review. "At first, this book seemed like the plot of one of the best TOS, I'm presuming that's Star Trek, the original series episodes. Then quickly, it revealed itself to actually be more like a certain dark TNG episode. That'll be the Next Generation then. There are some cool ideas and good characters introduced here, but sadly, there are multiple chapter chunks where none of the characters really matter, and nothing interesting happens. Not only that, but also the writer doesn't always seem to have a handle on the Doctor and Ace's voices. But the good parts were good, and I'd be interested in reading another higher rated book by this writer." And finally here's one from James Bowman. I'm presuming that's another pseudonym, and that's the Doctor's name that he gives in the TV movie. "Generally good, but uneven 7th Doctor novel. For much of the book, there's a really interesting central mystery and very interesting aliens, with only the occasional foray into military SF providing a distraction. The big bad's arrival is anticlimactic after all that build-up, although things start to improve once we get a feel for its actual character. Then, the finale is needlessly grim, even if the villain's defeat is elegant." There we go. That's what the readers think. So there's a good mix there. I think there's people acknowledging it's entertaining, if flawed. Remember, you can follow us on social media. We're on @Power of 3Pod on Twitter. We have a Facebook group which you can join, and we all share content and sometimes other things in there. And we also have Blue Sky, which is my personal one, which is @FinishedZine. So now it's time to go, and as ever we like to leave you with a tune, and I had a few options in my head. Firstly, always on my mind, Pet Shop Boys version of course, and there was also a Pet Shop Boys song called Casting a Shadow, which was for the Eclipse back in 98, 99, but I'm not going to play either of those. I also discovered there's a group called Shadowmind, and I listened to some of their stuff, and it's a bit too guitar heavy for my tastes. You know, I do like something a bit more poppy and electro, but ultimately I've decided to go for something that relates to Doctor Who and Shadows. So we're going to listen to Hank Marvin, formerly off of the Shadows, playing the Doctor Who theme. What could possibly go wrong with that? Until next time, I've been Kenny Smith. Bye bye.